What's up everybody, it's Scott from Stringjoy Guitar Strings. Today we're here talking about how to use a string tension calculator, or more specifically, how to use the Stringjoy guitar string tension calculator. If you're not familiar with the concept of tension as it applies to guitar strings, the easiest way to remember what tension is that the more tension you have on a string, the harder it is or the more force it's going to take for you to fret a note or to bend a note. So why should you as a guitar player care? Well, in general, what you want out of a set of strings, if you want your set of strings to feel natural, be comfortable to play, is for it to have fairly balanced tension from string to string. Now, this doesn't mean that every single string in your set has to have the exact same tension, or even that it necessarily should have the exact same tension, as we'll get into here in a little bit. But if you want it to play naturally, you want to have some thought put in. You want to ensure that every string is getting close to the previous string's tension, or at least if it has a little bit more tension or a little bit less, there's a reason for that. Ultimately, this is how you dial in a set of strings that's going to play, sound, and feel exactly the way you want to. Now, at first blush, this might seem really easy. You just plug in your scale length, your tuning, and then you move around the gauges until all the numbers match as close as possible, right? That's not really the whole story. There's a number of different things that we've learned over the years from designing custom sets of strings for tens of thousands of players that have taught us certain things that you want to be on the lookout for, or certain hitches that exist in certain sets of strings, or in general, ways of saving you time and money from having to try a bunch of different things and learn the same lessons that we have over the years. So that's why I made this video today. I wanted to show you all these little secrets and hacks that I've learned that I think result in making a set of strings that's going to both sound, play, and feel right to the majority of players. So we're going to cover electric guitar, acoustic guitar, and bass guitar today, all separately, because each of them have their own little hitches that I will hip you to. Let's jump in and talk about it. All right, so I know this might not be the most visually stunning video we have ever done or ever will do, but I thought the most useful way to do this is to have a screen share of what's going on my screen with our string tension calculator pulled up so that I can talk about it. So we're going to bounce back and forth there so that you can see me in action here on our tension calculator as we go over all these things. So really quickly, let's just cover the very basics of the tension calculator. So up here at the top, you can select your instrument. We've got electric, acoustic, and bass up there right as we're filming this. If you select something like acoustic, where we have multiple alloys, or electric in the future, you can select those different alloys here under type. And then we've got number of strings, which varies depending on what type of strings you're looking at. On electric, we've got 6, 7, 8, 9, and 12. If you hit any of those, it'll pull up those strings. And then there's two different ways to adjust the scale length. One is the overall up here, where you can just change everything all at once. And the other is these individually. So if you have a multi-scale, you can set each string to have its own scale length independently, or you can just reset it up here. Then everything else is pretty obvious. You've got the pitch of a string. Here, if you're not familiar with seeing pitches in octaves like this, the higher the number, the higher the octave. So an E4 is a lot higher than an E0 or something like that. Everything will come preset the way that it generally is in that instrument, so it should make it pretty easy to tweak things up or down depending on what your needs are. Then finally, we've got our string section here, which again updates depending on what strings we sell for a given type. But you can select any string, and then over here, it'll tell you the tension of that string, and then down at the very bottom, the total tension. And finally, there's always going to be a link below that where you can click over to our custom set page so that you can order any of these string sets at no extra charge once you find those gauges that you know you're going to love. The link to this tension calculator, by the way, is down in the description. You can also find it at tension.stringjoy.com. If you want to follow along on your own computer while we do this video, that's totally fine too. You can go ahead and pull that up now. So first things first, we're going to jump into some notes on the electric guitar string side of things, and then we're going to get to acoustic strings and bass strings a little bit later. The first thing when it comes to electric strings that I want to impress upon you is that you really generally want a little bit more tension on your wound strings than you do on your plain strings. I know that it's easy to look at something like this and say, man, it'd be great if I had exactly 18 pounds tension on every single string, regardless of whether it was wound or plain. That would look really nice, and if it looks really nice, it's probably going to play really nice, right? But looks can be deceiving. Numbers aren't everything. It doesn't give you the total picture. The issue here is that the only thing that's being taken into account when we're looking at a tension measurement like this is the overall mass of a string. It's not taking into account the geometry of a string. What I'm talking about there is how a plain string is basically a steel bar that's uniform all the way through, whereas a wound string is a core wire wrapped with an outer wire. Because of this geometry, wound strings are able to be more flexible than plain strings at the same mass or at the same gauge, and because of that, you need to adjust everything just slightly so that everything will actually truly play and feel balanced. My general recommendation is that anywhere between 2 and 4 pounds of difference there is going to feel fairly balanced. It doesn't mean that you can't go heavier than that to get like a husky feel or a heavy bottom feel or something really crazy like progressive tension or something like that. But generally 2 to 4 pounds is kind of that magic window, I think, if you want your wound strings and your plain strings to feel pretty balanced with one another. What you're generally looking to do with a tension calculator while you're building out a set like this is to balance the plain strings so that they have as close of tension to one another as possible, and then separately balance the wound strings so that they have as close of tension to one another as possible. It might be that your wound strings have 6 or 8 pounds more tension on them than the plain strings do. As long as they're balanced with each other, generally your set is going to feel the way you want it to. Now there is a question here of how precise is precise enough and how precise is too precise. I know looking at this for the first time, you might see that we have 17.8 pounds tension on the 10 and 18.2 on the 13.5 and think, man, if only I had a 10.279, then it would be perfect. But I wouldn't recommend looking at it that way. These things aren't quite as precise as they seem. Generally, if you can get things within 1 pound of tension of one another, things are going to feel really, really awesome and balanced on your own. There's a level at which you can't really feel past to feel how much more balanced something is. You know, you can't feel the difference of 0.1 pounds or even 0.5 pounds in most cases. And on the other side, these tension numbers are based on measurements, but ultimately they're averages. This is how all tension calculators work. Strings will vary a little bit from one to another. So really trying to dig in too deep and get things to be completely perfectly precise is kind of wasted effort, because the actual strings that you get might not be exactly the same as what you're seeing here, just based on normal variability in something that's man-made and made by wire. So again, my rule of thumb is if you can get within 1 pound or even 2 pounds of tension, depending on the specific circumstance, you're going to be golden. But there are a few pointers I want to give you as you're walking through each string, because I've just learned over time some strings react a little bit differently with different measurements, and there's sort of general rules of thumb that I think work out for most players. The first one is that on your B or your G string, going way too heavy in terms of tension can really cause that string to stick out, especially on 3 on a side guitars. Those strings just tend to have some issues already. So it's something to keep an eye out for. In general, a set like you see right here, where less than half a pound difference from string to string is going to feel really natural. But what I'm getting at here is I wouldn't necessarily want to go with like an 18 like you see down here and slope the tension up like this, as you see in some progressive tension sets where we have just a little bit more tension on each one. I think when you do that, you're going to end up with something that tonally isn't going to be what you're going to like. That B and that G are just really going to stick out. So I try to keep those balanced if I can, or even sometimes with a little bit less tension. If I'm making a choice between going a pound up in tension or a pound down in tension relative to the high E string, I'll usually opt for the pound down. But again, that's just me. Your mileage may vary there. Now the next thing to keep in mind is something that we're going to run into again and again on every single instrument, and that's that when you get down to the lowest string, or occasionally lowest strings, here I'm talking about like string 6 or 7 and 8 on an electric guitar, or things like that, even on a bass, the low E or low B. When you get down to these strings, you start to have a different issue pop up, where if you go too heavy relative to the gauges in front of it, you might balance the tension out, but tonally you're going to have this really big boomy low E string that isn't going to jibe all that well with the set. Now, what I'm getting at here is not that you shouldn't, try to balance this out as much as possible, but having a little bit less tension on that lowest string can often be, a little bit of a good thing. I think this is one of the areas that a lot of the mainstream string sets that you see from the big guys, I see what they were going for. They would use a 46 right here, and that for them I think kind of solves that problem. For us, I think a 48 works even better, but it kind of depends case by case. What I'm really getting at here is if you have something like an 8 string I'll pull up here, trying to get that 20 pounds tension on the bottom 8th string and going up with a 90, I think is going to be a little bit of an overcompensation. It's going to be quite a bit heavier and quite a bit boomier and louder than the other strings in the set. So when I get to really heavy sets of strings, like 7 and 8 strings in general, I look to slope that tension down just a little bit on the 6th or 7th or 8th string, just to make things a little bit more comfortable. Like you see here with this 20 pounds and 17.6, and then 16.7 on the 60 and 80. I find that little slope down in tension makes things fit just right on a lot of those sets and makes it so that tonally everything balances out really well with a nice smooth balanced tension. You can have your tension heading in different directions or taking gradual slopes throughout your set. That's okay, as long as the distance in tension from one string to another is happening at a smooth rate and one that you're comfortable with. This will be fine. But this is something to keep an eye out, especially if you're doing like drop tension set or drop tuning sets of strings or 7 or 8 string sets. Keep an eye out for that balance there, and don't try to overcompensate with that lowest string just to get the numbers to match and end up with a set of strings that doesn't sound right. All right, so now we're going to jump over to the acoustic side of things. I'm going to be looking at our natural bronze, but we've also got our bright brass on here. There's just a couple of very minor tension differences, gauge by gauge, over on the bright brass side of things, but in general, anything that works on one of them will hold true on the other as well. So the big thing that we're going to notice the first time we roll over here is that there's quite a bit more tension on strings 3 through 6, all of our wound strings, than there is on our plain strings. There's almost 6 pounds more tension in kind of your average set. And that looks just kind of wrong to the naked eye. I understand if I didn't know better and I came over here, the first thing I would do is try to balance out these gauges so that they were a little bit closer together. But if we do that, we're going to, in most cases, end up with a set of strings that's not going to sound right. See, on acoustic guitars, not only do things have to play balanced, but they especially have to sound balanced, because you can't just adjust your pole pieces to balance out different levels of output from different strings. The overall set needs to really have a consistent sound altogether. The issue here is that steel in general is going to have quite a bit more output than the bronze or brass alloy that we wrap around steel to make a wound string. As a result, if we balance the tension just right, those steel strings are going to really, really outshine the wound strings, and you're going to end up with a set of strings whereby when you strum, you can really only hear the high B and E string, or whatever you might tune them to, rather than hearing the full overall chord in a really nice balanced way. So in this case, we actually like this disparity of tension. I think about 6 pounds or 7 pounds is fairly normal. You could even go higher than that if you wanted to go with an 11.5 and a 15 or something like that. That would be okay too for a particular effect. Bluegrass sets of strings will work this way quite a bit, but it's all up to you. But in general, there's a reason for that. I think it's normal to preserve it, but I want to give you all a heads up about that so you don't go changing that around a ton and end up with a set of strings that doesn't sound good. The second note on the acoustic side of things is that, similar to the electric strings, when we get down here to the low 6th string in the set, trying to get our tension to match just right can usually lead to things not sounding sonically balanced as well. So for example, having a 42 on the 5th string and a 54 on the 6th string, you can see here we've got a little bit of a tension disparity, about 1.8 or so pounds tension, but this is a set that sounds really balanced. When we go up to a 56, we get the tension numbers closer, but in general, you're only going to hear that low, boomy 56 way over the middle of this set of strings, so we try to avoid that. I know that this can all take a little bit of experimentation to get just right. How do you know when something's the exact right amount of distance between two different gauges in terms of tension and in terms of tone and all that? You're welcome to hit me up if you have any questions about that. Also, in general, when you try things, you will learn and see what kind of works for you, works for your guitar. Generally, guitars might be different, but I find that for almost all acoustic guitars, these two rules of thumb are pretty good to stick to. All right, so finally, let's roll over to the bass side of things. We've got 4, 5, and 6 string options on here that you can use to get things kind of working the way you want. The two big caveats I have for bass: first, the most important thing I think is that the tensions on the bass side of things are especially approximate. Bass strings have multiple layers of wrap wire. Depending on how thick they are, they might have anywhere from 1 to 3 or rarely 4. And because of that, all those different winds, you end up with a little bit more variation from bass string to bass string than you see in a typical set of electric or acoustic guitar strings. So even more so than those other two examples, we see more variability here, and that means that the actual real-life tension might differ even a little bit more than a set of electric or acoustic strings. I bring that all up to say, when you see something within 1 or 2 or even 3 pounds tension difference on bass, that's going to be a lot more balanced, relatively, than it would be on a set of electric or acoustic strings. That's generally within the range that we look for here. The only other note that I have for bass is the same note that I had for electric and acoustic, which is that getting everything to balance tension-wise on the very lowest string, which could be this E or a B or even an F sharp if you're going way, way, way down, can lead to some tonal issues. And that's one reason why you see things like a 45 to 100 set of strings being fairly popular, or in our case, we have like an 85 and a 105, where we have quite a bit of a difference here in terms of tension on that low E, but ultimately I think that leads to a set that balances a little bit more sonically. Basses have a tendency to get really, really boomy on that low E string already, and if you go way too much, or even just a little bit too much in terms of your gauge difference there, you can end up with a way louder string. Now, if you do want to get a balanced set of strings, something like an 80-105, where we're getting that tension a lot closer on those, that is okay, but you're going to have to do some work on your pickups to balance everything out a little bit more. If you have something like a P-style pickup, where you can take down that very, very low E a little bit and get everything to balance better, that'll work great. If you have other pickups where it's hard to adjust individual strings and you can only adjust the whole bar, it might not be worth the trade-off. So it kind of depends on you. Your mileage, again, there may vary, but it's something that I recommend against balancing if you don't know that you're willing to put a little bit of work into your instrument to get everything to balance sonically as well as tension-wise. So there you have it. That's String Tension Calculator 101. There's a lot more to know. I've been using tension calculators like this for years and years and years, and have found all sorts of little hitches and things like that, depending on what you're trying to do and what gauges you're trying to do it with. But I think this is a pretty good primer if you've never really experimented with these before, or if you have, but you've never really known exactly what you're doing. I think these tips will save you a lot of trouble and get you close to finding the set of strings that's going to work the best for you. Hey guys, before we wrap up, I wanted to make one other note here. If you've played around with other string tension calculators or tension charts in the past, you might notice that the tension readouts for our strings are a little bit higher than you've seen on some of those other ones. There's a few reasons for that. One of them is that a lot of string tension calculators in general are just kind of pulling the same mass information that D'Addario put out decades ago, and they're kind of using that and acting like it applies to all different brands of strings. There's actually really differences between different brands of strings. They have different tensions, and if you've played with a lot of them and noticed that they're always the same, it's just because they're all based on the same numbers, and this one isn't. Second, in general, the way that we wind our strings, we have a little bit of a tighter distance between wraps. In general, we try to have almost no distance between wraps, so we have a really, really nice, compact, and tight wind on the entire string. The result of that is more mass, which does lead to more tension. The thing is we do some other things in how we construct our strings, the chord to cover ratios we pick, and the ways that we wind them that we think makes them feel really slinky. So, in general, what I'm getting at here is while the numbers might look a little bit higher than what you've seen, it's not like you're going to pick up a set of our strings and they're just going to feel like a brick. We do a lot of things to ensure that even though we have very high mass strings with more mass than a lot of other companies, they're feeling really, really balanced and slinky as well. So just keep that in mind as you're playing around. If you see those numbers being higher, it's not a big cause for alarm. So if you haven't already, hop on over to tension.stringjoy.com, play around, do a little bit of experimenting, and find a set of strings that you think is going to make you excited to pick up the guitar. If you find something that you love, you can always get that as a custom set from stringjoy.com at no extra charge. And just remember, a lot of times when you're figuring out what's going to work for you, it takes a little bit of trial and error. The only way that I figured all these things out was by trying a million different combinations and seeing where the differences were between the numbers themselves and the actual way that strings played or felt on a bunch of different guitars. So be patient with yourself. If you're willing to learn and dive in and figure out a lot of things about string tension and become a string nerd like myself, I think it's a very fun and rewarding experience, and this is definitely the first step that's going to get you there and give you the power to select strings for yourself and then, evaluate those and see what happens. So if you already have a custom set of strings that you love, I would love to hear about it down in the comments, or if you jump over to the tension calculator after this, play around with it and find a set of strings that you think is going to work awesome, Put that down in the comments too. I check them pretty often. If you have any questions, you're welcome to leave them down there below, or just say, hey, I think this thing's going to work really well for me. What do you think? And I'll be happy to advise. Also, if you want to keep things, one-on-one and you just want a little bit of help picking the perfect custom gauges for you, hit me up at scott@stringjoy.com. I am always here and always happy to help.